One of the most unsettling things that's been happening over the last decade isn't just that wars are continuing, it's that so many new ones seem to be starting all at once. Today, we're going to dive into a pretty tough but really crucial topic, this global shift towards a state of constant, simmering, and often explosive conflict. Let's try to figure out what's driving this dangerous new reality. And this quote from humanitarian organizations, man, it just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? It suggests we're moving into a totally new phase, one where the fragile peace so many of us took for granted is becoming the exception, not the rule. And listen, this isn't some far-off prediction. For millions of people around the world, this is their daily reality, right now. So yeah, that's the big question, right? What are the real forces pushing this trend? And why does it feel like so many different parts of the world, with all their own unique histories and problems, are all hitting a boiling point at the exact same time? Well, it really comes down to a few key shifts that are all feeding off each other. The old international rules, the ones that were supposed to act like guardrails to slow things down, they're just being ignored now. At the same time, new tech is totally changing what war looks like. Drone strikes are just routine, and military AI is jumping from sci-fi movies to the actual battlefield. And then you throw in this superheated political rhetoric that makes compromise almost impossible and makes conflict feel inevitable. Okay, to really see how this plays out, let's start in Southeast Asia. We're going to look at a conflict that doesn't always make the headlines, but it's a perfect example of how old, forgotten disputes are catching fire again with a new and really dangerous intensity. For years, you've had these small, contained skirmishes along this long, poorly marked border between Thailand and Cambodia. It was a known friction point, but it was manageable. But lately, something's definitely changed. The whole dynamic has shifted. What used to be minor clashes between patrols has blown up into full-on artillery duels and even airstrikes. That simmering tension has officially boiled over. And this isn't some abstract military problem happening in empty jungles. It has a massive, immediate human cost. Look at this number. In the recent flare-ups, more than 500,000 civilians have been forced to flee their homes. We're talking about entire communities being uprooted, caught in the middle of a fight that's suddenly gotten way harder to control. And as you see in so many of these conflicts, the war on the ground is matched by a war of words. Both sides have completely different, totally irreconcilable stories. Thailand's military says its engineers were ambushed out of nowhere while working on a road. Cambodia, on the other hand, says no way and accuses Thai soldiers of poking and prodding them for days, trying to start a fight. When the stories are this far apart, there's just no common ground to even start talking. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The why. See, the real problem here isn't just about what's happening on the border. It's all being driven by politics back home. In Thailand, this fight has become a huge symbol of national pride, especially after a leaked phone call really stirred up anti-Cambodian feelings. And for Cambodia's military, they see this as a test of their strength and credibility. So the bottom line is, neither government feels like it can afford to back down. And the result? Frozen talks and ceasefires that just keep failing. All right, let's shift gears and look at what happens when the world's major powers get involved. This is where the stakes get raised, dramatically. This is where a local flashpoint can have immediate global consequences, pulling everyone into what they call the great power game. Off the coast of Venezuela, there's been this quiet but pretty huge military buildup. Officially, the U.S. says it's all about stopping drug trafficking, but unofficially, it's pretty clear it's a way to put immense pressure on President Nicolas Maduro's government. Of course, Venezuela sees it differently, accusing the U.S. of wanting to control its massive oil reserves. It's a classic standoff, just full of suspicion. And we're not talking about a small force here. The U.S. has moved about 15,000 troops into the region. To be clear, this isn't some routine training exercise. This is a major military deployment, a force big enough to send a very, very clear message. And this gives you a sense of the kind of heavy-duty hardware we're talking about. A dozen warships, aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers. This isn't just about having a presence, it's about projecting overwhelming power and creating a ton of leverage over the entire situation. So look, a full-on invasion probably isn't in the cards, but that's not the real danger here. The real risk is a mistake, an accident, a miscalculation, one controversial strike on a ship, one tense moment at sea, like when that oil tanker was recently seized. That's all it could take to trigger a rapid, uncontrolled escalation. And if that happens, this could become the most serious military confrontation in the Western Hemisphere in years. And that, of course, brings us to the one flashpoint that keeps strategic analysts up at night more than any other. Because a war over Taiwan wouldn't just be a regional conflict, it would be a global event. It would completely reshape the political and economic world we all live in, and it could happen almost overnight. Now, while everyone's nightmare scenario is a huge amphibious invasion, most experts think a blockade is a more likely first move from Beijing. But let's be clear about what that means. A naval blockade to just choke off the island from the rest of the world would still be a straight-up act of war. It would almost certainly trigger massive shockwaves through the global economy and put immense pressure on the US to get directly involved. So these individual flashpoints we've been talking about, they don't exist in a vacuum. Their consequences ripple outwards, right? They create these huge zones of instability. They fuel unimaginable humanitarian crises, and they force a total rethink of global security, especially in places that are already struggling. So take a look at West Africa's Sahel region, in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The jihadist insurgencies there aren't just continuing, they're actually expanding. And now that violence is spilling over into countries that used to be stable, like Benin and Togo. This isn't just a few isolated attacks. It's creating a vast region of instability. And what makes it worse is that the international support that used to help contain this is now drying up. Meanwhile, in Sudan, a catastrophic civil war is grinding into its third year with absolutely no end in sight. It's just a brutal, grinding fight between two rival military groups, and the human cost, well, it's become almost impossible to even comprehend. Just try to wrap your head around this number. Around 12 million people have been forced to leave their homes inside the country. That is a massive chunk of the population. Doctors, farmers, kids, all driven out with nowhere safe to go. It's a crisis on a scale that's just hard to even picture. And that's on top of the more than 150,000 people who have been killed in the fighting. This is no exaggeration, one of the most devastating humanitarian crises on the entire planet right now, and it's happening almost completely out of the spotlight. And this is a perfect example of how these internal fights just pull in outside powers. Sudan is basically split in two, but it's the heavy backing from regional players like the UAE, Egypt, and Turkey, who all have their own agendas, that turns a civil war into a proxy war that just can't be solved. With weapons and money pouring in from all sides, nobody can win, but nobody is willing to stop fighting. Okay, let's head to Europe, where the war in Ukraine is having consequences far beyond the actual battlefield. I mean, this timeline shows a really clear pattern of escalation. This isn't just about the fighting in Ukraine. It's about a wider hybrid war that includes violating NATO airspace, sending spy ships to map critical undersea data cables, and just relentless attacks on civilian infrastructure. It's a campaign designed to destabilize and intimidate. And the way Europe is responding, it tells you everything you need to know. For the first time in generations, governments are seriously getting their people ready for the possibility of a large-scale war. Conscription, a word that felt like it belonged in a history book, is being debated again. Military spending is skyrocketing everywhere, and top officials are flat out warning people that the era of peace is over. The whole mindset of the continent is changing in a way that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. So when you put all these pieces together, the old border disputes, the superpower rivalries, these sprawling regional crises fueled by outsiders, you start to see this larger and, frankly, deeply troubling picture emerge. It's a picture of a world that is settling into a new and much, much more dangerous reality. And honestly, the crazy part is we've barely scratched the surface. We haven't even had time to really talk about the ongoing crises in Gaza, the horrific violence in the eastern Congo, the decades-long standoff in Kashmir, or the civil war in Myanmar. The sheer number and spread of all these active conflicts just hammers home this one disturbing idea. This isn't a series of isolated events. This is the new normal. And this all leads to one final, really tough question. If armed conflict really is becoming the defining feature of our time, what does that mean for our future? For diplomacy, for global stability? And most important of all, what does it mean for the tens of millions of people whose lives are already being completely reshaped and often destroyed by it? That is the unsettling reality we all have to start to understand.